Today's reading is Matthew 7, 1 through 12. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds, and to him who knocks the door will be opened. Which of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will you give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets.
Okay. So by now, I hope that everyone is starting to sort of get the heart behind what Jesus is saying on the Sermon on the Mount. So he's teaching about his kingdom. And everything about his kingdom is contrary to the way that we imagine that it should be. The people experiencing God's blessings aren't who you think they are. The pecking order isn't what you imagine it to be. And the good people aren't necessarily the people we think of as good. And the godly people are almost never the ones who seem the most godly. And we also learn how God's economy doesn't run on the same system as our economy, and how the more you grasp after money and security, the more your money has control over you. And the economy of Jesus' kingdom runs on the principles of trust and generosity. And his kingdom doesn't just turn our values upside down when it comes to money or power, it also transforms the way that we look at the people around us. Because let's be honest, in our own little day-to-day lives, in our own kingdoms, you know, we love to measure people, right? We size them up, we keep mental scorecards, who's who, who's in, who's out, who's respectable, who's questionable. But Jesus says that in his kingdom, we don't get to sit on the judge's chair. In fact, the way that we treat others, especially the way that we evaluate them, exposes whether we really understand the generosity of the Father. And that's why Jesus begins by addressing the problem of judgment. And I say that because it is a problem. Like if you've read the Bible, or if you're a student of church history, or world history, or American history, or any kind of history really, you may have come to the conclusion that on average, we do a pretty bad job of exercising judgment. And many of the people that history remembers as champions, pioneers, discoverers, you know, in their time by their peers were judged wrongly. You know, Galileo was condemned for teaching that the earth revolves around the sun. William Wilberforce was mocked for decades for fighting against the slave trade. And the Wright brothers were dismissed days before their first flight for the impossibility of powered flight. And I could go on with a lot of examples about that. but I won't, because the point is just that we get things wrong, and we do it a lot. And if human judgment is already sort of unreliable, then when we add the weight of religious authority, it can become even more dangerous. And history is full of examples like the Spanish Inquisition, the persecution of reformers, the Salem witch trials, all kinds of these sort of mass hysteria events where people claimed God's authority and then went on to inflict harm on others. And one thing that religious people seem to be pretty good at is thinking in more of a black and white version of the world. And that was certainly true of the Pharisees in Jesus' time. They'd spent so long studying the scriptures and writing them and teaching them that they kind of took their interpretation, their thought of what the scriptures said, and put it up on as high of a shelf as they put the scriptures themselves. And there's something powerful that happens when you claim that God said something, especially something that he didn't necessarily actually say. Right? The Pharisees used God's authority to back up their interpretation, and along with that, their view of how people needed to live. So that was their view of politics, their view of family life, of worship, of everything. And when your religious system offers you hard positions that God didn't really feel the need to give us, then you get to where you're in serious danger of inflicting that same harm and injustice on innocent people that God created. So this is what Jesus is warning against in this passage. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye?" So it's like we're all walking around with these huge blind spots, and it's easy to think of the other people as doing that. It's not just secular people, it's not just the Republicans or just the Democrats, it's all of us, right? And so we have these huge glaring flaws that we're just desperately trying to cover up, and we are going at the same time and looking for flaws in other people. It's like the kids on the playground that are pointing and laughing at the weird kid because, well, then people aren't looking at me so much. So we're more than willing to extend grace and to overlook the sort of flaws of the people in our own camp, in our own tribe. But when it comes to the people who are outside of that, we tend to be, really judgmental. We tend to look for these flaws, throw them in their face, and anything that we perceive as flaws along with it. And then when it's religiously motivated, we come to doing it from a place now of self-righteousness. And like the Pharisees, we climb on top of our little soapboxes, our moral high ground, and we throw condemnation now down beneath us to the godless heathens that are just so far below us. Right? And we're not always necessarily confrontational about it either. Sometimes we don't want to stir up conflict or have to be mean to someone's face, so we just kind of, behind closed doors in our little groups, we just kind of tear each other's character and whatever it is about a person down behind closed doors. And when Jesus says, "Don't judge," this is exactly the kind of behavior he's talking about. Right? He's saying not to condemn, not to be judgmental. And he's not saying to not exercise discernment. Right? Judgment condemns a person, but discernment is just it's just a judging of actions. Judgment assumes the worst, but discernment just seeks restoration. It just discerns what's happening. So Jesus is saying to be careful. He's saying that the one person that you are most qualified to pass judgment on is yourself. And if we can learn to do that, if we could turn the microscope around on ourselves before we turn and point the finger outward, and often we find that the problem may have been with us all along. So I'm going to give you a picture that might sound a little silly at first, but I think it gets right at the point of what Jesus is saying. So I want you all to imagine that you're walking around in your day-to-day life dragging a wagon behind you. And not you alone, but everyone. So when you walk around town, you've got a wagon, everyone's got a wagon. And, what's in these wagons is kind of like the contents of our heart. Okay, it's our motivations, our desires, all of our baggage, or skeletons in our closet, they're all back there in our wagon. And every once in a while you're out and about, you take the time to glance into someone else's wagon, and you are shocked and horrified at what you see. Because the wagon is full, like absolutely up to the brim, with poop. And I know, it's gross. It's shocking. And can you even imagine being the person carrying around with a wagon that's full of poop? And it's probably pretty important that that person does something about that. It doesn't just affect them, it affects all the people around them. It's affecting you right now. And right when you're feeling pretty confident about yourself and saying that you would never allow that to happen to you, you turn around and then you catch a glimpse of your own wagon, and guess what? Yeah, poop. And at this point you should be much more horrified, right, about the poop in your own wagon. And now you might not like this illustration, and that's fine. But you have to admit, I think it really hits home, right? Because walking around and stinking up the place is kind of the position that we've all been in, right? We've all been that person. And it always seems like the problem is someone else. But Jesus says, until you deal with the stuff in your own wagon, the plank, he says, sticking out of your eye, you have no business pointing the finger at anyone else. And then, right after that, he does something weird, because he finishes his analogy with the plank and the speck, and it feels like he just abruptly shifts gears, and he brings out this thing about, he says, don't give dogs what is sacred. Don't throw your pearls to pigs, and if you do, they'll trample them under their feet and turn around and tear you to pieces. Right now, dogs and pigs, they're Bible metaphors that are used in their culture to refer to people who just aren't interested in receiving truth. So Jesus isn't insulting people. This isn't like a racially motivated thing like it seems like in some of the Old Testament. Rather, it's his culture's way of describing a stubborn rejection of wisdom. And it seems a little contradictory that he says this right after telling his audience not to judge. Right? Because it is a judgment to say, okay, that person over there is going to reject out of hand anything that I'm going to say to them, so I'm not. So, don't waste the precious gift of the gospel or of reconciliation or of reaching out to another person, to somebody who has repeatedly and clearly shown you that they'll just mock and trample on what you have to offer. Right? So I want to be clear, the way that Jesus is teaching his followers to live, he's not teaching as if it's optional, but what Jesus is calling us to here, it's the exercising of wisdom. Right? So verses 1 through 5, where we started, Are Jesus telling us not to be hypocritical? And then verse 6 here is telling us to not be naive. You know, he's doing this thing where it happens a lot in the wisdom literature. We see it in the Proverbs, where you take these two seemingly contradictory things and you just place them next to each other, and you as the reader, you as the learner, have to figure out just what do I do with that. You know, a good example of that is Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. They read like this. Don't do that. So verse 4 says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him." That makes sense. We all understand that. And then verse 5 says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." Okay, that's clearly and obviously two contradictory statements, right? And the point of it all is to build wisdom, to build understanding, to build up the muscles, to discern how to act in these different situations. Because in our day-to-day lives, we find ourselves in all kinds of situations that require this kind of discernment, this kind of, judgment without judgmentalism, right? So we have to make judgments. It's just part of navigating life. And especially in this day and age where, we have all of this technology and social media, like our lives are they seem more complicated than they ever have been, and it's absolutely imperative that we judge wisely. But it's also more important than ever that we don't condemn. So how do we gain wisdom to exercise discernment without veering into self-righteous judgmentalism? Right? And that's the thing that Jesus talks about next. He says this: "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you'll find, knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be open." Right? And we often hear this verse used as kind of like, just blank check from God, where like if you just believe hard enough and pray hard enough, God will give you whatever it is that you want. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. Right? He's still in the same train of thought that he was in verses 1 through 6. And the thing that we're asking for here, the thing that we're to be knocking for is wisdom. Right? It's the kind of wisdom that knows how to see clearly and that can discern without condemning. Right? And this kind of wisdom, it doesn't just show up on our doorstep overnight like an Amazon package. It's formed slowly over time. It's the result of what Christians have long called spiritual formation. Right? And it's the slow, steady shaping of your heart so that it begins to look like the Sermon on the Mount, like the Father's heart. Right? And that's why Jesus connects ask, seek, and knock with the next thing that he says, which is, "In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets." Because it's a core truth to the faith. It's not like just a nice saying that we can cross-stitch onto a pillow at Grandma's house. Rather, it's the fruit of a life that is formed by the gospel and by the teachings of Jesus. Because here's the truth. We're all being formed by something all the time. Right? And the things that we practice are the things that we get good at. Michael Jordan, I think he's a good example. Widely considered to be the best basketball player of all time. Like, he didn't wake up one day and just decide, I'm going to be better than everyone else. Right? He had to constantly push his limits. He studied film. He practiced until his hands were raw. He'd often, visualize his techniques and plays as he laid in bed at night. So that, every dribble, every pass, and every shot done over and over and over again was shaping his instincts so that when he was in the heat of the game, all those things came as second nature to him. Right? In spiritual formation, it works the same way. right? You don't just drift into living the golden rule, and you can't just wake up and say, like, this is the kind of person that I'm going to be today. You practice it. You train for it. And day after day, you show up to Jesus asking, seeking, and knocking, and he shapes your heart until mercy, generosity, and love become second nature. Right? So what does it actually look like in real life? How do we practice the golden rule and cultivate the wisdom that Jesus is talking about? Right? So I talked about the golden rule as the fruit of spiritual formation. So I'm going to stick with an agricultural metaphor. So sticking in that vein of thinking, our faith is like the seed, right? And that gets planted. And now you can live your whole life with just a seed of faith. And maybe that's fine. But that seed can't produce any fruit on its own. You need to water it. You need to nurture it. You need to make sure that weeds aren't stealing all of its nutrients. That is the cutting things out of your life that steal spiritual growth. It might mean turning off the news or getting off social media. It's prayer. It's the asking, seeking, and knocking part of what Jesus is saying. It's choosing where to spend your attention. And with proper nurturing, that the little seed, it sprouts into a little sprout, I guess. A little bitty plant. And then you have to continue to nurture that plant, and it will grow and build the strength in itself to bear the fruit. Right? That's the self-reflection and the removing the plank from your eye, the scooping the stuff out of your wagon that we talked about earlier. Right? It's extending grace to people inside and outside of your own tribe. It's practicing generosity, and like Jordan, it's practicing over and over for years until it brings proficiency. And that's what brings maturity. And after years of care, nurturing, pruning, what started out as a little seed, it can bear fruit. And that fruit can be a blessing for you and for everyone else in your life. Right? And it's not about, having all the right answers. It's not about being perfect. It's not about being just a better version of yourself. But it's about being formed into the heart of Christ. It's learning to see clearly, learning to love generously, and to extend mercy rather than condemnation. So as you leave today, ask God to reveal what's the speck in your eye, what's the plank in your eye. Seek His wisdom in removing it, and just keep knocking at that door until your heart begins to reflect His own. And only then can you truly extend mercy into the world around you. To your neighbors, your coworkers, your family, and even those who may seem like your enemies. And when we learn to live that way, to practice the golden rule, exercising discernment without condemnation, you find that you're participating in something that's much greater than any of us really understand. You become like this channel of God's grace, and you become someone who's able to make the world maybe just a little more like the kingdom that Jesus is preaching about. And that is the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. It's not rules to follow, and it's not like a standard that we're expected to achieve, but it's a life that is transformed slowly, steady, and faithfully into the image of Christ. So let's pray. Father, thank you for caring enough about us to send us Jesus. Thank you for His teachings and for His sacrifice. And Father, I just ask that you would mold us into the community that you desire for us to be. And let this be a place where your mercy and your love can be extended to those who you send to us, whoever they might be. Lord, I just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.